So this presentation is called Freelancing 101, which is you may or may not think is an accurate title by the time I'm done with it. So it's more like TMI, the presentation. So I will talk a little bit about freelancing for those of you who are curious about it, and the kind of the pros and cons as frankly as possible versus a so-called real job. But most of it is just kind of my story and how I got here. That's me, in case you still don't know. I'm Davey. And I've gone back and forth between freelancing and having traditional jobs ever since I turned 16, arguably even earlier. So, freelancing. Be your own boss. Sleep until noon. Work in your pajamas and slippers. Right? Yeah, basically, that's the only difference. Get to wear your underwear. I mean, and nothing else, potentially. Except for those video chats. Then you have to wear a shirt and... Anyway. So, but why really? Why would anyone want to not have a traditional job and give up that safety? I'm going to share someone else's story first. This is Geoffrey Zelman, and there just happened to be an interview with him released the day before I gave this presentation the first time that I thought was just such a perfect fit for this. He's one of the sort of founding fathers of web design and remains one of the best known web designers out there. He is a big part of why the browser makers eventually adopted standards instead of perpetuating the nightmare that I told you about on the first day of class, where Netscape and Internet Explorer just kept building proprietary features and nothing worked the same across the two. He started something called the Web Standards Project and wrote a very influential blog post called "To Hell with Bad Browsers." That we were all just like, yeah. It was great. Anyway, so he's that guy. And before he struck out on his own, he worked in advertising full-time back in the late 90s. And here's how he described this. I was working as a creative director at a New York startup in 1999. Despite my title, I felt powerless to affect the company's product or even control our design and code. I just wanted to design simple websites that mattered and charge a fair price for my work. So I quit. You're all early enough in your careers that maybe this doesn't yet resonate with you. Maybe it does. My last job was as an enterprise software manager and project manager for a very large organization, 40,000 employees and about 1,000 IT workers. And I was managing a big, important project and managing the developers responsible for implementing it. But I was powerless. Despite my fancy title, I was not empowered to make any decisions that really affected the outcome. The real decisions were being made by people who made 3 or 4 times what I did and who would probably never even lay eyes on the finished product. That's something that can be really frustrating, and it's a very real thing where the people who actually make all the decisions never have to live with the results of those decisions. And they may not even bother talking to the people who are affected by those. Did I have a specific example of this morning? I don't remember. I kind of feel like I did, but I don't know. Anyway, so yeah, despite my fancy title, I wasn't really empowered to make any decisions. The fancy suits were making all those decisions for me. So I quit. Zeldman continues, I spent too many of my formative creative years complaining about the decisions made by the people who paid my salary. It was time to stop complaining and start creating. So, reason number 1 to be a freelancer, freedom. If you're lucky enough to have enough work, you can choose what projects you work on. Get enough work that you can choose your clients and choose your projects. And better yet almost is that you can choose how you approach those projects. Sometimes not only will someone high up the chain make the decision of what you're going to work on, sometimes those people want to dictate very specifically how you do it, even though maybe they don't know anything about your discipline really. And it can be something like, this button has to be blue. No, not that blue, this blue. Why? Because my nephew really likes this blue, or it really brings out the color in my eyes, or whatever. But sometimes people who just don't understand that discipline at all want to be very dictatorial about that stuff. Micromanagers are a real thing, is basically what I'm saying. And a lot of times when you're a consultant, you still have to do what your client wants. But a lot of times you're brought in because you're an expert whose opinion they value, and probably they recognize where their expertise ends. And if they don't, you fire that client. Again, assuming you have enough work. Also, besides freedom, flexibility. Need to schedule a dentist appointment? Just do it. Just schedule it for whenever works out. I still try to make them like first thing in the day so that it doesn't interrupt me in the middle of work. But if the only thing they have open is 10:30, I can just take the 10:30 and not beg somebody for permission. Need to take your cat to the vet or your dog for the vet, you bunch of dog people. Do it. Variety. You might find it boring to work on the same project year after year. And as a freelancer, you don't have to be stuck on the same thing forever. My business partner, Miles, once said, I don't like anybody's idea well enough to work on it for more than 2 years. I'm not maybe quite that, I wouldn't put it quite that strongly, but I understand the sentiment, certainly. Getting to work on a wide variety of things helps you stay sharp, helps you experience working with a lot of people, a lot of different people, all of whom you can learn something from. When Seth started at Fretless, it was to teach an earlier version of this class with me. And then from that, which was Angular JS, and then next we did a couple of small projects in Ruby on Rails that we spent about a week apiece on. And then we did another small Rails project that was really mostly CSS, or more specifically SAS, which is a syntactically awesome style sheets. And he worked on those with me. And then he went off for, was it 3 weeks, by himself, writing plugins for a JavaScript rich text editor. Not React, not Angular, nothing like that. Writing plugins for this thing for a company that kind of specialized in that kind of thing. He'd never done it before in his life. So we did that for 3 weeks. And then we started working on this project for another company in Angular 2, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a complete rewrite from Angular JS. Bears basically no resemblance, and neither one of us knew it yet. And that was like the first 3 months. And we had to learn TypeScript and all that stuff too. And that may scare the crap out of you hearing that, but I think I don't want to speak for you, but I think you said like you really liked that.
Terrifying at the time, but yeah, looking back on it, I don't think I could have learned any faster than I learned.
And learning fast is a good thing. So, not going to lie to you, truly it is not for everyone. Presumably you're here because you're interested in coding, right? Using your wits and creativity to build products and solve interesting problems. How do you feel about sales and marketing? Do you like those? Is that what you really want to do? If you strike out on your own and you don't do those things, there won't be any of that more interesting work to do. How about bookkeeping? Sound like a blast? You like spreadsheets? You like balancing your checkbook? Is that the highlight of your month? Would you like another checkbook to balance too? Management. If you start even a small agency, as Miles and I did, expect to spend some time on traditional management tasks. Even if you are totally solo, you'll have to do some of those things. You may not have personnel to manage, but you will have to do some traditional management tasks. Did you really want to be a therapist? Is that what you were after when you went into computer science? Sometimes I have to be a therapist. I had a client who would get on the phone with me or on a video chat and just start like pouring his guts out, talking about like how hard it was to work with developers and how all the developers he's worked in the past have betrayed him and how developers just can't be trusted. Like, who do you think, who do you think I am? Why are you telling me this? And why are you paying me my hourly rate to tell me this? But, hey, if that's what you want. My dad is a therapist, and he doesn't make a net per hour what I do, so go right ahead. But there's a little of that, too. And there's kind of a little of that anytime you're in management, of course. You love attending networking events. You like hobnobbing. You like schmoozing. You like going and listening to people who are just there to show off. Does that sound like your idea of a good time? I absolutely hate that stuff, personally. Guess which one of these three people I think is the developer, the one who doesn't make eye contact. Got to do it. Or you got to go into business with Miles, and he'll do it for you. So anyway, you might be surprised by how much time you have to spend doing things other than whatever service it is you're actually selling. Maybe you actually enjoy that stuff. Besides the variety of getting to work on different projects, there's the variety of different types of tasks. There's programming, there's management, there's bookkeeping, there's sales, there's marketing, there's all that stuff. There's teaching. And like the teaching I really like, of course. Maybe you actually enjoy that stuff, or maybe it's simply worth suffering through it in order to have the level of freedom and flexibility that comes with going on your own. But when the heck are you going to do all that stuff? You need to spend enough of your time doing billable work that you can pay the bills. But you can't neglect those other things. Otherwise, you get to the end of your billable work and realize you have nothing else lined up. This is a guy with a bunch of arms. When you don't have traditional hours and can work whenever you want, and you're ultimately working for yourself, it is very easy to just work all the time. And maybe that is in your nature to be a workaholic, and that's what you want to do. But it takes a fair amount of discipline to say no more. I'm going to pay attention to my family, or I'm going to go see a movie or whatever. Because the temptation is always there. There's always more work that can be done. And when you're in business for yourself, it's very, very tempting, even if you don't want to do it. You may find that you want to do it. So be aware that that's a thing. And it'll always be tempting to sort of give up your life. So if I scared you away, you're running straight to the nearest cubicle farm to collect your steady paycheck. Not going to lie, there are very real advantages to so-called real jobs. Number one, stability. Truly, stability is the biggest advantage of a traditional job, depending on the job. Now, you could be working for a startup, which may be pretty unstable. You could be working for basically a stable company, but not yet terribly mature. Or you could be working for a really mature business like Salesforce or something that's, reached the enterprise level, and you know perfectly well that your paycheck is going to clear. I've had lots of friends who worked for startups who, like, every time payday arrived, they were never quite sure whether they were actually going to get paid. But generally speaking, having a traditional job, I wouldn't call working for a startup terribly traditional. You're going to get paid, and of course, they typically come with benefits beyond a steady paycheck. Paid time off, insurance, and those things are huge, maybe even bigger than this regular paycheck. So you kind of have to be out of your mind a little bit to choose freelancing if a steady job is an option. But if you are slightly out of your mind and have the same psychosis that I do, and you're not convinced that this is the worst idea in the history of ideas, where do you even start? And how do you know if you're ready to take the plunge? I don't have all the answers, and I don't have any business telling you what's right for you, but I can tell you my story and how I arrived here. Come with me on a magical journey to 1992, ish. That's when I started mowing lawns for money. Like so many other adolescents, including Seth, who got a lot more serious about it. I suppose that was kind of my first freelancing experience. I don't know. But I used that money to buy a computer because my family didn't have one. A couple years later, when I'd had my computer for about 2 years, I got my first modem. My first computer didn't have any way of doing networking of any kind. So I bought a modem, installed it, and now my computer could talk to other computers. I was mostly interested in using that to play Doom with my friends, just one-on-one. By dialing each other directly, I'd actually dial my buddy's number and hope my sister didn't pick up the phone. But I also tried CompuServe and Prodigy and America Online. No one called it AOL yet. So I got my first email address and all that. But at the time, those services didn't actually include internet access. You only had access to the walled garden that they provided. So in 1996, after about 1 million free trials of AOL, I finally got real internet access. So this was a neat trick. You got your disk for like a 30-day free trial of AOL. And then when your 30 days were up, you called and like, I want to cancel. And they're like, what if we gave you another free month? You're like, oh, okay. Then you do that a few dozen more times. Every once in a while, you'll have to actually cancel. And then you just take one of the other 8 trillion AOL floppies you've gotten in the mail, because holy cow, did they send those things out like crazy. And then just start another free trial. And then they started sending them on CD, AOL install CDs. And you get such a big pile of those, you could start using them in art projects and stuff. And if you didn't care much about your own life or the health of your microwave, you could stick them in the microwave. And it might explode, but it would create a really neat pattern on the CDs. Don't do that. But, you know. So in 96, I got actual internet access. And I even paid for a second phone line in the house, too, so there were no more conflicts over tying up the phone line. And a couple months later, I started my first web design company with a couple of my classmates. So I got internet access, and like 2 months later, I said, hey, I'm a web designer. Give me money. A little loony to do that, but my high school buddies and I were dumb, so it sounded better than Wendy's. So we hung out a shingle and we called it Web Exposure because the name was available. We got a business license and a pirated copy of Photoshop, and we were on our way. Don't pirate software, kids. Because I also then spent some time in federal prison. I didn't, but believe it or not, we got a client. Someone was actually willing to give us money to make them a website. Now, as it turns out, of the 3 of us, I was the only one who was actually interested in learning how to do this. So that didn't last very long, and our first client was our last. But hey, live and learn. So guess where I ended up? Wendy's. But a short time later, I convinced my parents that I should quit the fast food game and do solo web design. So now I was Star Image because the name was available. And I had a neat swooshy logo like every single other company in the world in 1997. Say you were AAA and you already had an established logo. Just add a swoosh around that crap so people know you're with it. You're living in the internet age. And I got one very small client, but that was enough to replace quite a few weeks of making $5.15 an hour in fast food. And I wish I remember how I got that client, but I don't. I remember being told no an awful lot, but I don't remember landing that first client. Certainly made it very low risk for them. It was only a few $100. A lot to me, but not much to them. And they had no web presence at all. So at worst, they went from having no website to having kind of a crappy one made by a high schooler. Then again, the handful of local businesses that did have websites all had sites that looked like they were made by a child. So, you know, they were no worse than the competition. When I did try to sell to local businesses at that time, the biggest challenge wasn't convincing them that I should be the one to make the site. It was convincing them that they should bother having a website at all. This was a huge barrier. It was really hard to convince people that there was any reason in the world to put their stuff on the web. And I was not a particularly good salesperson. So yeah, it didn't go great. But in 98 then, I graduated and spent the summer working for the YMCA and playing in a band, and endlessly redesigning my own website. Didn't have any clients at the time, didn't have time for clients. So I just redesigned my own site over and over and over to keep getting practice. Still not a bad idea if you have nothing else to do. Just make stuff for yourself. Then I started college and kept doing freelance web design instead of getting a campus job. And that lasted through the spring and the summer after my freshman year. I had several bigger clients then, like $1,000 or more, plus maybe a few bucks a month for hosting. I was really, really determined to avoid getting a real job. And I do remember how I got some of those clients. They were mostly people with whom I had some sort of personal connection. For example, I had a friend whose dad ran a bank. They didn't have a website, so I made the bank a website. My family knew some folks who owned a huge biosolids business. Anybody know what biosolids is? What biosolids are? It's crap. It is literal poop. So I'm only aware of one biosolids company. They're huge, and they're around Kokomo, and you'll see their tankers driving down the highway. Merrill Brothers in big red letters. Just know those tankers are not full of gasoline or something like that, or liquid nitrogen. They are full of actual crap. And I made them a website. And my brother-in-law got a job managing a dental practice, and they didn't have a website. So I made one for them. But I ran out of that kind of stuff pretty quickly. And when school started back up in the fall, I got an internship with University Computing Services. And this was pretty traditional IT work and a preview of what a real job might look like, albeit not a programming job yet. I was to spend a semester working the help desk, a semester sitting in the computer room and pulling tapes from the tape library when the mainframe called for them, and then 2 semesters doing some sort of programming. So the computer room, this was not that long ago, and this may still be the case, but so these were mainframes. These were big refrigerator-sized computers, and they used actual tapes, not the identical tapes to VHS or audio cassettes that you'd put in an old car radio, but the same magnetic tape. And what would happen is a programmer would need a piece of data that lives on a certain tape, or they would write a program that needed that. And then in this computer room, there'd be someone sitting there looking at a dumb terminal. It would start flashing, saying that they need this tape. So you go into the tape library, you pull that one off the rack, you stick it in this drive. And until you did that, they couldn't have their data. And that was a job that people did. And these were people who sat at these green screen terminals, people who knew nothing about computers really, who had this mainframe operating manual that was about that thick, just responding to stuff like that all the time. So basically, this campus job involved doing your homework and getting paid for it most of the time. So the summer after my sophomore year, I got an internship with a big employer in my hometown. And it paid really well, insanely well for a summer job for a college student. And it actually involved building web stuff for them, so I got to continue to do what I wanted to do. And by then, I had learned several programming languages, including a couple that were common on the server side, like Java, not JavaScript. I knew JavaScript too, but I knew Java by then, so I could build websites with persistent data and stuff. Office Space had just come out on video at that time, and so the other interns and I spent the whole summer talking about it as we were pretty much living it. If you're too young for Office Space, it's directed by the creator of Silicon Valley. Despite the overall nature of the organization, I was lucky to be working in a division that no one was paying much attention to besides my immediate supervisor, so I still got to do cool stuff and kind of have fun. If you can make it through life without having a traditional job, I'm very happy for you. But if you're determined to work for yourself and you just can't pull it off yet, I think your time with traditional employment will be well spent. You'll learn a ton about working with others, getting things done when you have zero power, how business works, and more than that, it's pretty darn hard to truly learn without experiencing. For example, you'll develop empathy for the people who still work in that kind of environment, who are likely to be your clients. It can be easy to be condescending toward the corporate drones or whatever. But if you've actually done it, then they're just people doing a job. So there's a lot to be said for having a traditional job. There's even a lot to be said for having a job that you hate, to make you appreciate the jobs that are just okay, because there's always something better. But if you've had something truly awful, you can always remember that when you start to feel like your job sucks. Like, yeah, but at least it's not that job. You'll hear about that job in a minute. So in the fall of my junior year, I started the kind of relevant portion of my university internship. And I had an experience that I've since learned is pretty common in internships. The full-timers who were supposed to supervise me as an intern were pretty annoyed to have me there. They didn't want an intern. They had an intern because their bosses made them take an intern. All it did was create more work for them. I wasn't helpful to them. I didn't know anything. I was just keeping them from doing their jobs because they had to come up with something for me to do where I couldn't really hurt anyone. Because, these were kind of important systems. We're talking about financial aid and stuff like that. They're not going to assign me a real programming task. They don't have time for that crap. They've got stuff to do. So he had to waste some time coming up with harmless activities for me to do just to get me out of his sight. He was not good at hiding his annoyance with my presence. So guess what? I quit. Newly emboldened by having had semi-real job experience and knowing some programming languages, I doubled down on the freelancing thing. I'd run out of ideas for finding clients myself, so I teamed up with my cousin in Illinois, and we started an S-Corp. It was like a real company. We had ink in our name and everything. We had a lawyer. Speaking of which, our lawyer didn't have a website, so guess what? We made one for him. And I learned this morning that he's still using the website. He's still using the same website I made for him in 2000. December of 2000. So my cousin found me quite a few gigs, and at this point, I really, really wanted to drop out of college, move to Illinois, and do this full time. My parents actually bribed me to stay in school and finish. They paid for my room and board if I wouldn't drop out. So I did, and that was probably a good thing because my cousin was also a full-time realtor and had decided to become a full-time law student as well. He has an overcommitting problem, so he didn't have a whole lot of time to find work for me anymore. So I kept the corporation alive and did a little bit of freelancing on the side for many years after that. But it would be a while before it would be my full-time job again. So I graduated in 2002 and got a job for a tiny, tiny software consultancy. When I started, I think I was one of 2 senior programmers, and there was another junior developer. And they hired me as a senior developer. I had just graduated from college. So why was I a senior developer? Because I actually had a degree, and the others didn't. I did not know what I was doing. Don't let that fool you. So my first month there was more than 100% turnover at that place. More people left than even worked there because everybody but me got fired, and another guy got hired and fired in the span of my first month there. So it wasn't really the picture of stability. Plus, I hated it. So after 6 months, I quit again, as I did constantly at that age, and started teaching for a for-profit college, one of those that you see advertised on TV that's basically like high school plus. And that wasn't terribly fulfilling, although I did have some fun. I can't say that the students were a whole lot like you guys. These were folks that really had no business being there, had no interest in being there, treated it like high school, and were treated like kids. So these schools like this, like if attendance is poor, they get less money. So if someone didn't come, we were expected to call their parents. These were like 20 and 21-year-olds. We were to call their parents if they didn't show up for class, which is illegal now, but I don't think FERPA was in place yet then. So it wasn't, this was college. So I got a couple job offers and I took one of them. And that job turned out to be a bad fit. And they reached that conclusion before I got around to quitting, so yeah. But I got another job. So for those of you keeping track, that is 4 jobs my first year out of college. But that last one lasted for a while. 7 years. For those of you who are saying 9 minus 3, that's 6 years. No. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Right? The first one counts. That's 7, depending on what time you started in the year. But I started early 2003 and quit at the very, very end of 2009. So I was there for 7 years. Now, I did a tiny bit of freelancing throughout that job, but I had a real job that I mostly liked for quite a little while. So when I started there, they posted a job for someone who knew PHP and MySQL, which I did. So I applied, I did the interview, and like they asked me one technical question. They said, "Do you know what DNS is?" And I said, "Yeah." And they said, "What?" And I said, translates domain names to IP addresses. They're like, "Cool. Okay, we'll let you know sometime next week." I've been in the car for like 5 minutes. I'm not even home, and they call me and offer me the job. Maybe I should have taken that as a warning sign. But this did turn out well. I was there for 7 years. So I started and found out what I was going to be doing. So this was a big data center. Rows and rows of racks full of servers and routers and switches and all that stuff. Big networking gear. And it was a backbone internet provider and an ISP for businesses. Like, you get your T1 from them. And to rent a cabinet, some servers in a cabinet, people were paying like $30,000 a month for this stuff. But the VP of sales got it in his head that they should get into the $10 a month web hosting business. You have to have a lot of volume to make anything doing that. And it was a very, very crowded market. I now remember why he did it, I found out. Just so he could offer it for free for people who worked for clients that he wanted to close. So say a manager for the Finish Line or whatever, an IT manager for the Finish Line is just about to sign, and he knows, well, that guy also does like IT for his church or whatever. So it's like, hey, give you free web hosting for your church. Like, oh, okay, cool, I'll sign. So that's what it was really for, I found out. But anyway, they started this $10 a month web hosting stuff. And so right, they needed someone who knew PHP and MySQL to help keep the web hosting stuff running, right? No. Here's what they needed me to do. So in my cubicle, I had 2 network feeds coming in on 2 different Class C IP addresses. So that's like the really high level. That's like the second number out of 4. So it would look like I was coming from completely different places. So on one of them, I would get onto like a message board for PHP developers or something. And I'd start establishing myself as a member of the community, answering questions and stuff, and becoming a valued member of that community. And then, a few weeks later, from my other Class C, I would go on and be like, "Hey, any of you guys know a really rad host for PHP developers?" Be like, "Yeah, man, you got to check out Puma Hosting, dog." And then say no one would suspect a thing. So yes, my job was astroturfing, fake grassroots. Not super satisfying. And it only lasted a couple months after I got there, and then they axed that project. And luckily for me, they didn't fire me when that happened. So about that time, they also acquired another company, a consultancy, because they wanted to go into the managed services business. So what they would do then is not only could you rent space in their co-location facility, but they would manage your networking equipment for you. If you basically an outsourced IT department. So they would do all your routing and all your network stuff. So I started reporting to the person they were putting in charge of that. I had a new boss. And he was like, "Well, what can you do? Send me your resume." So I sent him my resume. He was like, "Okay, well, I guess you can fix the printer when it breaks or whatever." Okay, so I became that guy for a little while. And so I just wrote a little trouble ticket system for myself to keep track of the requests from people because they didn't have one. I wrote one in PHP truly in an afternoon. And my boss saw that and was like, "Hey, you can do this kind of stuff?" And I was like, "Yeah." Like, "Well, we need that." Because this place also had a 24-hour call center, a NOC, a network operations center, 24/7, Christmas, Thanksgiving, all the time. And they had no trouble ticket system whatsoever. They truly kept track of calls in text files. Unsearchable, kind of a disaster waiting to happen. So, this 23-year-old kid wrote this thing in PHP that ran this place. But they loved it, and they kept requesting more and more features. And pretty soon, they were like, hey, we got all these cabinets full of routers and switches and stuff, and we don't have a system for keeping track of who's in which cabinet and which one of these identical rack-mounted devices is the switch for that customer. Could you build us something that does that? Like, yeah. So I just kept building this stuff. But I was the only programmer there. There were no other programmers in the entire company out of about 50 people. It was, however, 10% Daves, or 5 out of 50 of us were named Dave. But guess who was the last Dave standing? That's right. There can be only one. So it was up to, professional development, growth was entirely up to me. I didn't have a more senior developer sitting next to me that I could learn from, or even anyone else's code that I could look at to learn from. GitHub actually didn't exist at the time. So I maybe didn't realize that I was stagnating to the degree that I was, because I was still writing stuff that worked, even if it wasn't pretty. It was pretty to look at, but the code, holy crap, the code was terrible, except for the part where it worked. So after about 4 years of this, I convinced my boss that a full rewrite was in order, because they just kept adding on more and more features, and it was getting really hard to shoehorn this stuff into the old code that was originally written for me to manage, like, whose printer is broken. So they let me hire somebody else. I hired a guy named Miles, who was by far the best candidate for the job. And we started over from scratch. And we wanted to do it in Ruby, because Ruby on Rails had just come out. And they let us do it. I had prepared, a whole speech about, why, yes, it was safe to use this thing that no one uses. And even though, if we get hit by a bus, no one will be able to replace us because no one knows Ruby yet. I had this whole speech prepared, but I was like, yeah, we want to write it in Ruby. It's like, okay. It's like, oh man, I was ready to fight. So that's what we did. And it was great fun. And as it turns out, I had everything in the sun, including a birthday, in common with this Miles character. And we managed to get a lot of work done, despite the fact that it was super easy for us to just talk about music all day. So we did that for a few years, and it kind of reached the point where this thing was pretty polished, and basically worked. And so it kind of gone as far as we could go there. And besides, I was getting married to someone who lived in Bloomington and worked for IU. So I got another job as an enterprise software manager, and I was absolutely miserable. But before I left, we hired someone. It wasn't really to replace me. It was kind of to replace Miles while Miles replaced me or something. But we hired another developer on my way out the door. Of course, his name was Dave too, Dave Jones. And for as long as he stayed there, he never became Dave. He was always Dave Jones, because I was Dave already. That name was taken, even though we overlapped at that place for one day. So everyone called him Dave Jones till the day that we stole him from them. But anyway, so for 3 years, I worked at a place that really made me a very unhappy person, where all the horror stories that I told you about happened. But I learned a lot. It was a good experience. I learned a lot about what not to do, as well as some things to do, because they didn't do everything wrong. Large organizations have some things figured out. And mostly, I still actually have a fair amount of respect for that organization, just not the particular little tiny part of the organization that I work for. Like the way they handle change management. You got a big app running in production that a whole lot of people depend on. And you have a new update. Should you release that in the middle of the day while everyone's using it? Probably not, right? But there's a little more to it than that, to doing it safely. And I learned a lot about that kind of stuff there, as well as how not to run a meeting. And also that spending 90% of your time in meetings is probably not really helpful, especially if no one ever makes any decisions in those meetings. But we're not going to go there. So toward the end of 2012, and I just learned this story last night. Miles, who quit that other job about 3 months after I did and left poor Dave there by himself, Dave Jones, he was sitting in a conference, and the speaker was talking about like figuring out how you work best. Do you work best by yourself? Do you work best as part of a team? And Miles had been a solo freelancer for about a year and a half. And he was thinking, yeah, who am I kidding? I work better as a team. So he starts writing me a text. Hey, man, I was thinking, maybe we should start. Yes, for the love of God, please take me away from here. Let's start something. So we did, and it was called Fretless, and that's what I still do. So we lined up our first client. I very happily gave notice, but I politely gave 2 months notice, so they had plenty of time to find a replacement for me who would quit 6 weeks later. But then they found another replacement for me, and that person quit too. And then they hired another replacement for me, and that person quit immediately too. Fast forward 4 years, they do finally have someone in my old job, but my old boss is no longer over that position, so that person stayed. No connection there. That's a coincidence. Maybe I shouldn't upload this video. So anyway, yeah, about 4 years ago, or 4.5 years ago now, we started Fretless. And some of the reasons we wanted to do this. In those kinds of environments, there's often so much deadline pressure that you can never actually take the time to write something well. You just barely have time to make it work. And sometimes not even enough time to find out whether you broke something in the process. And I have worked with some software that came from organizations that are completely dysfunctional in this regard, and like nothing worked except the brand new features because they had no way of testing the old stuff. And so they would just break stuff constantly. It was awful. So that's not a very satisfying way to operate. I mean, maybe you don't care that much, but we cared quite a bit about like the craft of programming, and wanted to be able to take some pride in what we did, and we wanted to be able to like test our software and write automated tests for them. I have a whole presentation on software testing that we don't have time for, but like the obvious reason to test is to prove that it works, right? The slightly less obvious reason is to make sure that stuff still works after you introduce more features, right? So you're all pretty early in your programming careers, but have you yet run into a situation where, hey, it works. Let's add another feature. It doesn't work anymore. The thing that used to work doesn't work anymore. Yeah, right? You don't have to program for long to run into that. So, taking the time to write tests can catch that stuff so that you don't release it in that state. Because, once you're in the tens of thousands of lines of code, you don't have time to go through and actually click through every single previous feature to make sure it still works in every single case. Maybe if you work at a place like Salesforce, they do actually have a dedicated quality assurance team or quality engineering team whose entire job it is to test. But they're still probably writing automated tests. But if you work someplace where, like a sales-driven organization, even if it's a software company, the salespeople will go out to potential customers, and the customer will be like, well, that's nice and all. I'd probably buy it if it did this. Like, oh, well, no problem. It'll do that in 90 days. Hey, engineering, how long does it take to build this feature? 6 months. Okay, cool. You have 90 days. Good luck. Not making this stuff up. Happens all the time, and it's awful. And you do not have time to do a good job with this stuff if it's constantly like that. Because typically, if it's like that at all, it's like that all the time. And there's never time to actually write quality software. And we really cared about writing quality software. So if people won't let us write tests, won't let us take the time, we just don't work with those people. And we can explain ourselves and justify it and tell them, you're actually going to save time in the long run by testing now versus having everything break every time you push a new release. So anyway, stuff like that, caring about quality, wanting to be able to take time when we choose to get better, to learn new stuff, to teach, all that kind of stuff. That sort of flexibility is what really drove us. And after we'd been in business for about 3 months, we stole Dave Jones again from his previous employer, and he works with us now. So anyway, that's kind of a preview of the Dave Struess Too Much Information story of how this all came to exist.